So let me share. All right, well, thank you so much for having me, and thank you all for being here. My name is Chris Straughn. I'm a librarian here at Northeastern Illinois University, and that's a small-ish state school here in Chicago, Illinois. My official title is the Continuing Resources Librarian. When I was hired, I was informed that I would be dealing with serials, and that's not at all what I'm going to be talking to you about. What I'm going to be talking to you about is documenting a call number system. So I'd like to talk about why I needed to do that and how I came to need to do that. And even though this is sort of a case study, I'll also be talking a bit about things like organization of materials and theories of call number systems, and also share some tips that I hope you'll find useful. And I mentioned this earlier, but I posted a link to a PDF copy of the slides in the chat, and I'll be providing that later as well. So here's a brief outline of what I'll be talking about, just some background, discussing the problem, the structure of the call number system in question, some general considerations for when you do need to document a call number system. It's a pretty rare thing to have to do. I'll talk a bit about how we documented them and some of the unexpected benefits. So there is very, very little research out there on call numbers specifically. So this was a tricky and interesting problem to have to tackle. There's lots and lots of literature about things like subject headings, which are, naturally controversial, but call numbers themselves, not much out there. So I'd like to start by just briefly discussing how I got here. Some of you are probably students at Emporia State, so hopefully you'll find this useful. So I started my library career at the University of Chicago, in Chicago, Illinois. I was a grad student, and I started off by shelving books. Once I graduated, I moved up into the serials department. And at that point, I decided to get my degree in library and information science at the University of Illinois. And so given my background in serials and the fact that I had a new degree, I was fortunate enough to be hired here at Northeastern Illinois University, again, as the Continuing Resources Librarian. And it was a bit of a surprise when I was informed that I would also be in charge of the Gov Docs. So that's what we call government publications in library lingo. GovDocs is a really specific field of librarianship. It's one that a lot of people are a bit afraid of, just because it is really complicated. And in fact, there's a webinar series out there called Help, I'm an Accidental Government Documents Librarian. So that sort of tells you how a lot of people get into this field. That being said, there were a ton of resources available. So the Federal Depository Library Program has some excellent trainings. There's a local group called the Northern Illinois Depository Libraries Group, NEIDL, and they've been a great help. I'm sure that there are similar groups throughout the country. There's a state documents interest group, and then there's also GODER, which is an ALA roundtable, the Government Documents Roundtable. So, for GovDocs and indeed all fields of librarianship, you're never really alone because there are always plenty of really helpful, friendly librarians out there. So just some brief background on government documents. So simply speaking, they're just publications issued by government bodies. So it's usually the federal government here in the United States. But there are different publications, obviously, produced by states, counties, cities, and in a lot of cases, NGO publications like UN publications are treated like GovDocs because they are similar in scope and type. And there are a number of depository programs. So a depository program is where the agency that publishes these things, so publications of the federal government or of state governments, send them out to libraries for preservation and also to inform the public. So when you think of government, these depository programs are really some of the most, I guess, high and noble sorts of programs out there, because their goal really is to inform the public of what the government is doing, how tax money is being spent, to provide information and educate. So along with getting free materials, libraries then are bound to a whole lot of regulations. This is one of the reasons that GovDocs is such a tricky field and one that can frighten people off. So for example, in Illinois, the regulations do vary state by state. We have to retain everything that we get for at least 5 years. We can't just throw things away if they are no longer relevant or we don't want them anymore. We have to submit a list to the state and get approval, and it's really quite complicated. Additionally, you have to allow the public in. So if you are a big private university with controlled access to your library, but you are a depository library, you are legally obliged to allow people in to use the government publications. Most depository libraries participate in the Federal Depository Library Program, and that's administered under the Government Printing Office. So here's a picture of Northeastern Illinois University Library. This is our main campus library. We've got 2 branch campuses, but this is the Ronald Williams Library here on the main campus. And we've been a member of the Federal Depository Program since 1963. We've been a depository for Illinois state publications since 1968. And the GovDocs have a dedicated location on the 2nd floor. And guess what? The periodicals are also on the 2nd floor, and that's why I ended up in charge of the GovDocs, because it was convenient. So I'm sort of the 2nd floor librarian is really a more honest title for me. So our federal publications are arranged according to a system called SUDOCs, that's short for Superintendent of Documents. I'll talk a bit more about that. But when I first arrived, I had no clue how call numbers were produced for state publications. So just as an example, here's what one of them looks like. This is the call number for a title called Illinois Fruit. So, you know, when I went through Federal Depository Library Program training, they taught me all about SUDOCs, but I still had no idea what to do with the state stuff. You know, this federal government does not obviously issue state publications and has no control over them. So there was some sort of call number system that I needed to figure out. So before we get into this main problem, I'd just like to think about how we might organize our collections, because there's a lot of ways to do it. And, you know, the most common one, of course, is subject, but you could do something like accession number. This is the most basic way to organize anything. You just slap a number arbitrarily on everything you get. So the first book you get would have a call number of 1. The second book you got would be call number 2. You know, if you are on Instagram, you might arrange your books by color because it creates a really cool background. So again, I said most things are organized by subject, but if you look at, say, Library of Congress or Dewey classifications, which are primarily subject-based, there are places within those call number systems where the notion of subject breaks down, and you do have to organize by things like language. So literature is a genre. So you have the subject of literature, the genre of fiction, and then within that genre, it's broken down by date, then by author, and then by title. So even though one of these things might be the primary means of organizing, it's not necessarily the only means that we have. I'm sorry. So you'll notice here at the bottom corner, I've got provenance. And if you're used to Library of Congress or other classification systems like that, you're probably not as used to provenance. And provenance is something that comes to us from the world of archives. So in archives, most things are organized by provenance. So what that means is that the organization or individual who creates, collects, or maintains different records or publications, all of those things are organized by person or organization, not by subject, not by genre or format or anything like that. It's the organization that's primary. And this has been adopted by the library world in some instances. especially for government publications. And what this means in the library world is that the materials are organized by agency and then within each agency. So let's take the Department of State, for example. That would be the main agency, and then you would subarrange by sub-agency. So maybe, the Foreign Affairs Division of this Department of State, that would be the sub-agency. And then lower on down the rungs, you do use different organizational schemes like title, date, or author. And when you put all these pieces together, you create a unique call number. So just as an example, here's a page that I created for our archives here at Northeastern Illinois University. And you can see how archival arrangement can sort of parallel a call number system. So they don't talk about class stems or anything like that in the archives world. They talk about record groups. So record group H, for example, is the Academic Affairs Division of the university. And then within that, there's different, subunits of academic affairs, and it's subarranged that way. So I mentioned that the Secretary of State might be a good way of thinking about that, and that's because the Superintendent of Documents system, or SUDOCS, is a provenance-based system. And this system was created in the 1890s by the woman pictured here, Adelaide Haase. And she created it when she was working at the LA Public Library and later moved on to Washington, D.C. to help the federal government come up with a way to organize all of their publications. Prior to this, there was no real organization system. And archival arrangement was happening at the same time in Europe. So it's possible that she was inspired by the happenings in Europe in terms of provenance-based organization to create the SUDOCS system. Incidentally, Adelaide Haase is just a super fascinating person. She's one of my librarian heroes. She was an early adopter of the bicycle. She was super outspoken and a lot of people really disliked her. J. Edgar Hoover, later in her life, J. Edgar Hoover had it out for her. So she's just incredibly fascinating. I recommend that all of you read up on her. So based on the notion of provenance, a bunch of state systems came into existence around the mid-20th century. So I've been collecting these just because I think they're really interesting. So one of the earliest ones was the GovDocs system created in California. And that's sort of its own system. A lot of these look a lot like the SUDOCS system. GovDocs is a bit different. GovDocs in turn inspired Texas documents in 1974. And many thanks to Bill Sowers at the State Library in Kansas. He provided me with some great information about the Kansas system. So if you've got the PDF of this, you can click there to see more about that. And these state systems are usually created and maintained at the state library, and very often they're not used outside of the state library. So typically, if there is a depository system in the state, it's likely that the library that receives state publications will just organize them by Dewey or Library of Congress or whatever system they use locally. And this is not the only system that uses a provenance-based organizational scheme for their publications. So the United Nations uses one that was created in the 40s. Canada's got their own scheme called CODOC, and that was created in 1966 based on a system from the University of Guelph in Ontario. And the National Library of Nigeria created their own system in 1967. So you can see that it's sort of a mid-20th century thing to begin to think about how we should organize government and NGO publications. So it's part of a large overall trend. And eventually I would like to do some more research on the genealogy of these systems just to see what inspired what, because they have a lot in common. And it'd be interesting to explore that aspect of the history of librarianship. So back to my problem. My problem is that I've got this state publication scheme. I don't know what's going on, but I do have some clues. So clue one is just looking at the call numbers on the pieces. So we've got this call number here. It's a trail map of Starved Rock. That's one of our local state parks. I grew up going there a lot. And So if you know about SUDOCs, you know that the letters at the beginning are a department class stem. So I'm going to take a stab in the dark and guess that CO stands for the Department of Conservation. The S79 looks like some sort of cutter. I'm betting that it has to do with the word starved. That's sort of the first major term in the title. And the 986, that's a date. That's how SUDOCs used to do dates before the year 2000. They just dropped the 1 and threw the date on there. So if you compare this call number with a SUDOCs call number like I have below, they have a lot in common. They've got a period, they've got a colon. So it all looks very familiar. So clue 2, one of the staff members here, when I was trying to figure out what was going on, came in and pointed to this tattered book and said, you need to use this. So I, at this point, was not aware that there are multiple cutter systems. So those of you who aren't proficient in cataloging might not know this, but a cutter is a part of a call number that takes a major word. It might be an author's name or just the first major word in a title, and uses that to distinguish that particular book from other particular books. So under the Library of Congress classification system, their cutter would be S737. In our system, using an older cutter Sanborn table, that's S79. And the cataloging calculator is super for producing Library of Congress cutters, not so great for these older style cutter Sanborn cutters. So that was great to figure out. Clue 3 was these cards. So I inherited a very, very large office. It's really more of a room with tons and tons of drawers full of who knows what. And among those drawers, I found these cards, and they appeared to be some sort of shelf list of Illinois publications, and some of them enumerate the various state agencies. But without any more information, I had no clue how to use these. So obviously I held on to them, but they weren't super helpful. A fourth clue was talking to other libraries in the state. So I mentioned that most state publications use a system that is organized and created and maintained by the state library. Our state library organizes their Illinois publications by the Dewey Decimal System, so they weren't a great help. So I looked at the catalogs of all other of the 19 other Illinois depository libraries. I found out that 16 of them either use Dewey or LC. I found out that the Chicago Public Library uses a system that's superficially like ours. I've got some great contacts there, thanks to the various groups that I'm a member of. It turns out that their system is completely different from ours, completely unrelated. It's just because they use a SUDOCs-based system that their system even resembled ours in the first place. But again, after some discussions, it turned out that their system is completely different and homegrown. And the University of Illinois at Chicago, UIC, after some correspondence with them, it turns out that we use the same system. They don't have really great documentation, which is unfortunate. But again, I had some great conversations with the people there about, how their system works. So what this means is the state of Illinois uses 4 different classification schemes for their systems: the Dewey, Library of Congress, Chicago Public Library, and this 4th system that we use here at Northeastern Illinois University and that UIC uses. So again, University of Illinois at Chicago was somewhat helpful, but didn't provide me with great documentation. So after paging through some binders, librarians used to love their binders full of documentation, I came across a mention of the Nakata strange system. This was just mentioned with 0 explanation, but after some Googling and some research, I was able to find this publication. The classification scheme for Illinois state publications is applied to the documents collection at the library, University of Illinois, Chicago Circle, Chicago, Illinois. That's the old name for the University of Illinois, Chicago. They dropped the circle bit. So just as an aside, one of the authors, Yuri Nakata, she's another one of my library heroes. She's super fascinating. She's unfortunately no longer with us. But just reading what little I've been able to find out about her, she was a huge proponent of government publications, very passionate about them. She grew up in California and was unfortunately interned in the Japanese internment camps during World War II. She was close with James A. Michener through his wife. So she led a really full and fascinating life. And fortunately for me, published this volume explaining how she and her co-author Michelle Strange believed that Illinois publications should be assigned call numbers. So at this point, you might think that I have enough clues and that I probably don't need to document, but that's not actually the case. So the first problem is that provenance-based systems are very difficult to work with, and that's because if there is no governing agency that assigns these call numbers, then they tend to get out of control very quickly. So I keep mentioning the SUDOC system. That's controlled by the Superintendent of Governments and the FDLP and the Government Publishing Office. And every time you receive a federal publication, you get the call number alongside it. It's in the OCLC record. You don't have to do any work. Obviously, this isn't the case for our system because the state of Illinois uses Dewey. So even though the University of Illinois Chicago uses the same system, our implementations are necessarily unique. So the outline by Nakata and Strange was published in 1974, and Northeastern and the University of Illinois at Chicago have not corresponded since then or collaborated to ensure that our call numbers match. So I mentioned the cards, and I was able to put together how to assign new call numbers with the help of the Nakata Strange book and the cards. But again, these are difficult to work with. A lot of us are doing remote work, and even though I am here in the building very often right now, I don't want to have to lug cards around when I go back home or, just need to assign a call number. Cards are pretty unwieldy. And we do get new materials, so we need to assign new call numbers. And then a final reason why the clues simply aren't enough is because we can do other things by creating this documentation. And one of the things that sprung to mind is that as a provenance-based system, we should be able to produce something of a history of the structure of Illinois government. This, as far as I know, does not exist. So we could approach this through the lens of the library to see who was publishing what when. And the call numbers can provide us that sort of information. So provenance-based systems, these are, as I mentioned, very difficult to work with. So just because there is a lack of oversight, it means that our call numbers can be drastically different from location to location. So here's a title. It's a very cute little publication about wildlife in Illinois. And you can see that Northeastern and University of Illinois at Chicago have given this title two very, very different call numbers. Again, we haven't corresponded about this since 1974. So we use DNR for the Department of Natural Resources. They use NR. The numbers afterwards are different. We interpreted the Cutter table differently, and then we put Spanish at the end because we want to indicate that this is a Spanish manifestation of this work rather than the English one. So just to go over this again, you can see that we use different prefixes. That's not really part of the call number. This just tells us and our users that it's an Illinois publication. But you can see that the agency is different. The numbers immediately following the agency indicate a sub-agency. Then the cutters are different. So here's what the call number structure looks like. So we start off with the class STEM, as I mentioned. There's a sub-agency number, and these are arbitrarily assigned. So next time the library gets a publication by a certain sub-agency, we're going to have to give it a number, and we're probably just going to choose the very next number in line. So if I get, a new publication from the Office of the Governor, and it's, the bureau of our governors in prison, because we've got a lot of those in Illinois, it would be G5, would be the next subagency. Serial numbers are another place we get into trouble because, again, these are arbitrarily assigned call numbers. So we've got a system for our serial numbers where the first 8 mean something. So it makes sense to have annual reports first. That's .1. .2 is where we stick monographs, things that don't fall into series. But after 8, we just begin assigning new call numbers. So back to our example, the 27 indicates that we have gotten through from 9 to 27 in terms of serial publications produced by the Bureau of the Budget. So this is a rapidly growing list, and without coordination, these numbers are going to change very, very quickly. So there's a specific class of things. If you're familiar with SUDOCs, you know that the legislature and various non-constitutionally created agencies start with Y4. It's the same thing in Illinois. So these are just fleeting boards and commissions, things that exist temporarily, and they have similar but slightly different call number systems. So the Y3 and Y4 sort of act as a class stem, and then we create new subagencies based on a Cotter system. So I'm not going to bore you with the details, but I just thought that that was important to share, that there are some call numbers that are really quite different. So here's where we differ. The state agencies, they change regularly. So like I pointed out, the Department of Natural Resources was not in existence in 1974. We had the Department of Conservation instead. So when that came into existence, we had to come up with a new agency class stem. Subagencies, these change constantly. State government is not thinking about librarians when they come up with new agencies and merge them or change their names. So if you've ever worked in authority control and cataloging, you can share my frustration. And having to assign arbitrary new numbers is just an added layer of difficulty. Likewise, with new serials or series, these are being created constantly. You might have a set of publications about one thing, and that'll lead into a set of publications about another thing. So starting with the subagencies and series, this is where the numbers get really arbitrary. It's almost like an accession number system, and things get difficult. So just to recap, here's where we differ. So what this meant for me was that for our system to work, we needed detailed documentation that went down to the level of the series. So I made a number of mistakes along the way in creating my documentation, and that's why I initially presented a poster at ALA and why I'm talking to you here today. There are some things that you should definitely consider if you ever are in a situation where you do need to produce documentation. So first things first is to consider why you're doing this. So I've explained why I had to, I think, hopefully clearly. It's a provenance-based system that uses a bunch of arbitrary numbers. But another reason to create this is because it's a system that's still in use. We get publications of the state every day. I just got some in today. And a system in use, it means that we are going to need to consider both staff and patron needs. So we need to create this because we want staff to be able to use it and patrons. We might want to document because we're talking about a unique system. So something that's unique can tell us something about library history. And I think that that is something that librarians tended to neglect. We're great about documenting others' history, but not our own history so much. And then a final consideration in terms of the why is whether or not it represents a unique ontology or organizational structure. So every time we classify things or create a hierarchy, we're telling the world something about our philosophy. We think that these things go together for some reason. So it could be useful for a history of government, but it could also be useful, looking at the Library of Congress classification, for example, because it can tell us and people in the future how we thought about the world. After that point, I think it's useful to consider detail. So in my case, I used a lot of detail because I knew that staff was the audience. It's a growing system that we still use, and because it's a provenance-based system. If I were just creating something for patrons, I might just produce a nice little poster that had like, here are the class stems and what agencies you'll find where. Likewise, if the system was no longer in use, I don't think I'd need to document as much simply because, there's no need. And classificatory systems, again, there's a lot less that's arbitrary in those systems, so they require less detail. So when I first started, I thought that my best path forward would be to take these cards and to enter them into a database. That was a really bad idea because it was extremely time consuming. Instead, I abandoned that fairly quickly. I realized that I could query our ILS, we use ALMA, and just pull every single call number for our Illinois publications and then export that to a spreadsheet, break it down, and I was really quickly able to come up with a good organizational scheme without having to enter data from cards. Ultimately, I did compare with the data from the cards just to ensure that everything matched up. And a benefit of, not entering data from cards or even from the Nakata Strange book is that it ensures that any documentation that I create will match what's actually on the shelf. So it's great that, the cards and the Nakata Strange book have guidelines, but if that doesn't help me find things on the shelf or create new call numbers because it differs from the actual situation out in the real world, then it's not so useful. And a final consideration is to consider access. So think about who needs what. So obviously patrons don't want as much detail as staff do. If you can make something searchable, that's great. Something web-based is fantastic because that's super accessible, especially in this day and age where a lot of our libraries are still not fully open. And likewise, consider longevity. So like I said, I used a database, but that's difficult to use. It's on a web host, and who knows if that web host might go away someday. So great for me, not so great for anyone else. Websites, again, are great for access, but not so great for longevity. So consider putting all of your documentation into a PDF and just updating it once a year. PDFs are great. You can share them, you can print them. So they're much less likely to disappear. And save all of your documentation. So I keep mentioning these cards that, are somewhat confusing and difficult to use. I do plan on saving them just because if the worst comes to worse and our web server crashes and the PDF goes missing, at the very least, we'll still have the basics of our documentation. So I've sort of alluded to what I did, but let me just break that down. So I created a database on the library's web server. This database was in SQL. Any of you who are students out there, I highly recommend taking a class in SQL. I took it when I was in library school just for fun, and it turned out to be incredibly useful. Most of our databases, our ILSs, use some sort of relational database, so I recommend that. So I entered the class stems and subagency numbers manually. That was pretty quick to do. Then I pulled the data from the ILS, I normalized it, stuck that in the database, and then was able to just match everything up. So I was able to show exactly what publication was related to what agency. And then by doing it that way, I was also able to see whether or not I'd missed any agencies or sub-agencies. And then once that was done, I compared the data with some other cards just to ensure that I had a really complete representation of everything that we had. So only about 50% of our state documents are fully cataloged. So things that are on the cards might not necessarily be in the catalog. So then I turned the data into a website. I took the SQL, ran it through PHP, and made it into a nice searchable website. So it's got a search function. I've designed the navigation so that you can approach your problem in a bunch of ways. And then finally, it turned all of the data that I had into a PDF, just for the sake of conservation, being able to have something that I could throw in a thumb drive and not worry about things going missing. So I'd like to take you on a quick tour of the website. So here's the site. I've got a bit of history, some information about structure. So I got a new publication today and had to figure out how to classify it. So it was a publication of the Illinois Commerce Commission. So just type in Commerce Commission. And this shows me a whole bunch of things with the word commerce and commission in it, but I was able to go straight here and see all of the publications. And if you scroll to the bottom, you can see this new publication that I've had to add. So there are a whole bunch of different ways to go about navigating this. I think that that's a particularly useful feature to build into any website. So if you don't want to search, you can just scroll through the various agencies. So, governor's office, you can click there and then see the subordinate offices, scroll through titles. So let's see, we want to see publications of the Governor's Working Conference on Daycare. That's here. Looks like they don't have any publications, but we know that that agency existed at the very least. So if I ever get anything published by them, I'll know where to put it. So, oops, sorry about that. So once I was done with all of that, I encountered a whole bunch of unexpected benefits. So if you're in doubt about whether or not you should document your call number system, maybe you think, I don't need to do this, it's a small collection, or it's not really something that people use, there are some benefits. So one was that I was able to identify cataloging needs. So as I said, only about 50% of our Illinois publications are barcoded, which means that only about 50% are in the catalog. And so by having a breakdown by organization, I was able to identify the areas of greatest need of cataloging. So what I've got here is a picture of an album released by the Illinois Sesquicentennial Commission. So I thought this agency was interesting. I didn't know much about them. And when I looked in the website, it showed that they had no publications. So I knew it existed. And so I walked out to the shelf, found that call number range, and I found this neat LP. I also found a poem by Gwendolyn Brooks written for the Sesquicentennial, and turns out it was signed. So all along, the library had a signed poem by Gwendolyn Brooks, and we never would have identified that we owned this had we not undertaken this project. So this is a clear and wonderful benefit. Our associate dean has since asked me to put this in the archives for safekeeping because I was just sort of shoved on the shelf. So that's really exciting. It's now in our catalog. People can find it. So, we've got representation of a really great, unique item that we didn't otherwise have. And so in addition to just finding cool stuff and identifying cataloging needs, we can also use the documentation to pretty easily find improperly formed call numbers, titles that are classed in the wrong place, so on and so forth. Something else I'm using this for is to locate specific formats. So what we've got here are some of our state park brochures. These are some of my all-time favorite things. I think they're just really, really gorgeous. And so when I first started here, all of our maps, like you saw, there was an LP. Everything was just sort of shoved onto shelves with zero regard for format, for preservation status. And that's something I'm hoping to change. And one of my first projects is to find all of our maps and map-like materials to stick into a vertical file and hopefully later into a map cabinet, just to ensure that these things are conserved and more easily accessible. And by having a notion of what agencies produce maps, I'm able to narrow down my search for other maps. They're not always the easiest to find in any ILS. So sometimes it does take some legwork, but it's a lot less legwork just because I know what agencies are producing what. There's some big picture benefits that I encountered as well. So one is that we've got a mostly complete listing of state publications. I think that's pretty neat. Our state library is somewhat underfunded, like most state libraries are, I presume. So they don't have a lot of time to produce things like union lists of everything they've ever published. And that's a shame, but this is something that could help in the long term. And hopefully I'll get to collaborate with some other libraries in Illinois just to compare notes and see if we can produce something bigger. Another benefit, which I mentioned earlier, is that we've got a partial documentation of the structure of Illinois government. So that's pretty great. So again, this isn't something that's been documented anywhere until now. So this has led me to consider some future projects. So I am going to obviously going to continue to seek out misclassed and uncatalogued materials. Hopefully I'll find some more treasures like that Gwendolyn Brooks poem. I would love to find some collaborators here within the state to work on a structural history of Illinois government. There are people here on this very campus that have been doing something similar for Chicago City Hall and its makeup. So we've got some groundwork laid for how that might happen. And then finally, I would love to create a call number wiki. So if any of you are interested in this sort of project, please get in touch. There are all of these really interesting systems out there. I just got my hands on the Kansas State system recently, so that's super exciting. I'm a member of the Troublesome Catalogers and Magical Metadata Fairies group on Facebook. If any of you are interested in cataloging, I highly recommend that you join. And recently, someone working at a Catholic library had questions about these weird call numbers that she'd never seen before. And so she posted, and of course, I was all over that. And I was able to find this old work created, I don't know, like 100 years ago about how to create new call numbers for Catholic libraries because the Library of Congress system was insufficient for the sorts of things they were collecting. So, having all this information in one place would be super helpful. It would help with future documentation that others might have to do. So that's something I'm looking forward to working on in the future. So thank you all very much. Super glad that I was able to be here and glad to see all of you here. So we'll turn it over to questions. And also here's my bibliography. So I'm going to stop sharing. All right, and again, I've just posted a link in the chat to a PDF copy. So yeah, are there any questions? How many years did it take to get to the point you are at now? Well, I have been here for 2 years, and it's really only taken about a year to do this full documentation project. The first year I was just sort of floundering. I had no clue what I was doing, and I relied on the archivist who used to be in charge of government publications to figure out how to assign new call numbers. She was kind of floundering as well. So about a year. Yes, thank you, Bill. Bill just put in the chat a link to the GovDocs class list online. Yes, I actually saw that before. Yes, Oregon. I feel like we may have corresponded, possibly. I am collecting these systems, so someday I'll have a full list. And I mentioned the State Documents Collaborative Group. They are mostly state librarian folks, but there's a few university people like me that are in it. And I believe their LibGuide is collecting these sorts of publications as well. So let's see, in chat it says, you mentioned wanting to create this for staff and that they'd need more detail than patrons. What kind of feedback have you gotten from staff? Well, currently I am the only staff member who deals with government publications. I'm a department of one. So on the one hand, other people in the library have been very supportive, but they don't necessarily have to use it. So primarily it's for me, and then I, at some point obviously will no longer be here because I will either, move on or retire. So I'm hoping that this will be useful for the future, and hopefully, someday we'll get, a larger staff who will be able to use the system as well. Let's see, Julie asks, what group is the state library group? Let me get you there. Let's see if I can copy that link. Here we go. Here's the LibGuide for the State Documents Collaborative Group. So they're a GovDocs affiliate. They didn't start off that way, but it was just sort of an ad hoc group created by someone in Arizona just to get together. So now they're a GovDocs affiliate, which means that all of their meetings have ALA support, which is great. And there's their LibGuide. So I just realized that something I did not point out in the presentation, you'll notice that I keep using the term call number system rather than classification system. That's just sort of a personal preference. I think that a classification system feels more like the union of a call number system and subject headings, whereas a call number system is just straight call numbers. And because I'm not doing any subject analysis on these materials, I'm just seeing who published them. That call number system is a more appropriate term, but you can feel free to disagree. Does Emporia State offer any sort of GovDocs classes? I don't think that there was anything like that at Illinois. I'd just be curious to know if it's the sort of thing that's offered, because it seems like most people who end up working with GovDocs sort of fall into it. Oh, excellent. Good to know. Good to know. Yeah, it's such a specialized field. I've had to really go all in just to learn about it. To the point where some of my my coworkers are a little bit annoyed. Chris keeps talking about GovDocs. I'm like, come on, let's do a display on GovDocs. It's going to be awesome. Hopefully when people come back, I've got a collection of government cookbooks from the federal and state collections. So I'm hoping that I can put together a cool display on those, just because they're really kitschy and really dated, and just generally interesting, and that they all really promote specific products that the state either produces or that the federal government wants to sell. Yeah, my favorite, it's actually a federal publication. It's Nautical Notions for Nibbling, and it's produced by, I think, the, Department of Fisheries within the Department of Commerce, and it's just like these really retro seafood recipes. It's hilarious. Ah, yes, Bill says the Kansas Wheat Commission published an annual cookbook every year for many, many years. We have many of them. Yeah, it's exciting and fascinating, and there's this type of cheese that Illinois used to produce, and it's no longer, so you can't buy Nauvoo Blue, which is a real tragedy for cheese lovers. Just really interesting to see what the state thinks of its agricultural output, and what the state thinks we should do with it. Well, are there any more questions? Let me paste my email in the chat. So if you do have any more. Let's see, before you started this project, what had been your experience documenting processes for internal use? Previously, it was mostly just guides to doing specific tasks. So when I worked in serials at the University of Chicago, they had a very robust binding program. They had a ton of money, so they were able to bind everything. So I wrote up a very thorough manual on the bindery process. So I had some experience. To me, I think there's a slight difference between documenting processes and documenting things. So a process documentation is more telling people how to do a specific task, whereas documenting, a call number system or some other system like that, that's somewhat different. So, I hope my documentation is good enough for future use. I'm definitely going to be running it by more people as time goes on. But it's been a different experience doing it that way. And obviously, now that I've started here at Northeastern, I'm continuing to document just because a lot of stuff has documentation from the 90s, and that's just not going to cut it nowadays. 3 ILSs ago, so. All right, so I've put my email in there. Are there any further questions? No? All right. Well, thank you for inviting me. It's been a pleasure to be here. And thank you all for coming. Feel free to reach out to me. Yes, GovDocs are awesome. So, hopefully this will at least get some of you interested in GovDocs. So yes, thank you very much.